Hello, hello.
Hello. It's recording, so
Okay.
hello. I'm in the middle of reading what you wrote.
Oh. Okay. So are we starting on time? Or are we going to wait a little bit? How does it work?
I mean, there will be more students joining.
Hi, Caroline.
That's for sure.
Okay.
What do you think, Julie? We should wait a few more. Well, we have 3 minutes anyway until 7:15.
Oh, this is fun.
You'll see a lot of familiar faces.
Oh, nice. Very nice. How's it going, Sipora?
It's going very well. Rabbi Dweck did a really nice job just now.
What was his topic again? I forgot.
Kiddush Hashem, I think. I was in and out because there are phone calls coming in, but
yeah. Okay. Well,
Caroline, it's been a long day, huh?
we can't hear you. You're on mute.
Right, she knows. She's been doing the morning and the afternoon session.
Oh, wow, you've been into it.
I know, but do you know what? This morning I
know. I saw. I saw.
It's just
you woke up for Gila. You woke up for Gila. That's for sure.
I was really surprised that I did, but no, I missed the first one. I'll have to watch the recording. It is really early, but it's still really early now, so I still have quite a lot of things to do afterwards. So I can still have my evening.
Oh boy.
Someone is lucky.
Hi, Lucy. What's going on? How's it going?
I'm good. Thanks.
Good to see you. And I see here also Lila and Paulette. Welcome. I haven't had the opportunity to meet you before. It's nice to have you.
Lori, you know Pesci's granddaughter. You know Rivka Mantelbaum, right?
I'm sorry?
Rivka Mantelbaum. That's her grandmother. Pesci's her grandmother.
Oh wow, I'm such a big fan of your granddaughter.
Yes, and she's a big fan of yours. And I feel like I know you. I also know your husband because he went to school with my daughter and my son. Toby,
right, of course.
Toby
and I've met two of your children, both Rivka's parents, and also what's the last name now?
You mean the Harrises, Toby and Alex?
Yeah, exactly. Toby and Alex. Yeah, I think they were at our wedding. So
yes, that's what I'm saying. I know your husband Matti from the old days, from the Princeton.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was a nice crowd. It really was. They had a great experience.
Yes. Okay. So welcome to everybody coming into the Zoom. So Tipora, you'll tell me when to start, okay?
Okay. Maybe we'll just wait one more minute. I think then we'll start and people will join. Chaval on your time.
Okay. And we have when does the Rabbanit start? We have exact.
The Rabbanit starts at 7:30.
Rabbanit starts at 7. Wait, at
8:30. Excuse me. 8:30.
Okay, we're supposed to give a 15-minute break. That's the.
Yes, but there's a little wiggle room, I think.
Okay, like the screen's not.
If we get really into it, yeah.
Okay, Beseder. No, because I want to make sure that we leave. I
think people appreciate a little break.
Yeah, I think it's nice for people to have a chance. I want to make sure there's time for questions. So I say if we're a small group, then I think we can have questions during the shir as well. If the group gets a little bigger, then we might need to leave questions till the end, just so that we'll be able to get through some things.
Okay, Lori, I think.
Okay, should we get started?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So welcome everyone. It's great to see you here in Israel. It is the evening. I understand that for some of you, it's the middle of the day. I'm glad wherever you are, whoever you are, I'm glad that you made time to be with us today to learn some Torah. This shiur, and I understand this whole series is dedicated in memory of Mori Rabbi Rav Yehuda Herzl Henkin Zatzal. And one thing that's great about this particular topic is that in fact, Rav Henkin authored a number of halachic responsa that touch on questions really of acculturation or in halacha terms, what we call Chukot akum. It's not exactly the same thing. We'll have to explain why not. And so we'll have an opportunity really organically over the course of our learning today to see a little bit of Rav Henkin's Torah. So I'm looking forward to that opportunity as well. I want to start actually by looking, it's not the most official source, but it's a little bit of a framework. I want to start by looking actually at a Wikipedia entry. It's a Wikipedia entry about acculturation. And the reason I want to do it is because it's going to give a couple of different definitions or models for how acculturation, what it is and how it can play out. And what I'm going to want us to do, we're going to be starting our shir today, really looking at the sources, starting from the Tanakh. And what I'm going to want to do when we're getting into the sources is to kind of keep in mind these definitions and to think a little bit about where what we're seeing would kind of fall out in this particular conceptual framework. Is the Tanakh really a completely different conceptual framework, or is it connected to one of the definitions that we're going to see here? Okay, so I'm going to attempt to share the screen. I'm hoping it's going to work on the first time. Please bear with me. I'm pressing the button, hoping for the best. Yes, I think it worked. So nice when things work. I want to recommend, by the way, to any of you who can't see the rest of the class right now, on the top right, there's usually an ability to choose side by side so that you can both see pictures and you can see the share screen. So I'm hoping you'll do that so that I think it's a little more interesting, not just to be looking at words, but also to see faces. Okay, so I have this definition here of acculturation, a process in which an individual adopts, acquires, and adjusts. Those are three very different words, actually, right? Adopts, acquires, and adjusts to a new cultural environment. Individuals of differing culture try to incorporate themselves into the new, more prevalent culture by participating in aspects of the more prevalent culture, such as traditions, but hold on to their original cultural values and traditions. Now, pay attention because it's going to come up. Pay attention to the examples that Wikipedia brings, okay? At this group level, acculturation often results in changes to culture, religious practices, healthcare, social institutions, ramifications for food, clothing, and language of those becoming introduced to the overarching culture. So acculturation is usually talking about a person or group moving from one cultural environment or milieu into another. And now they provide 4 different models for how this might play out. The first one and the last one are going to be pretty clearly not what we're going to be aiming for as Jews looking at other cultures. The first one is assimilation. Assimilation occurs when individuals adopt the cultural norms of the other culture over their original, right? It's more or less, it's a radical form of acculturation whereby the old culture kind of gets thrown out the window and there's a total embrace of the new culture. Marginalization is when individuals completely reject not just a new culture, but their own culture. In other words, they become alienated completely from both cultures. Sometimes this can happen when people become displaced. The experiences that they go through make it impossible for them to inhabit their old culture the way they had been. It might alienate them from their prior culture. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that the new culture is one that they're necessarily going to want to adapt to or adopt or absorb. The middle 2 models are going to be the more interesting ones, I think, for us today. First, separation. Separation occurs when individuals reject the dominant or host culture in favor of preserving their culture of origin. This is what gets called the ethnic enclave. Yeah, so a community kind of comes en masse into another place and they stay among themselves, they keep their own norms, and they don't really adopt or adjust to the culture outside. They create their own pocket or enclave. And then integration occurs when individuals can adopt the cultural norms of the dominant culture while maintaining their culture of origin. Sometimes it can be biculturalism. Now, of course, also separation and integration aren't just in one valence. Like each of them can have different degrees to which they occur. A little more lingo, though I don't really want to get into it deeply. Other things about culture and acculturation that get thrown out is that there's Marxist idea of cultural hegemony. That's kind of an idea that there's a dominant culture that's going to sort of try to take over and shape the thinking of other cultures. It's when we talked about acculturation and even assimilation, the behind that idea isn't necessarily that the dominant culture is specifically targeting a minority culture or another group. The idea of cultural hegemony is really sort of an idea of, everyone needs to be absorbed and learn by taking on this culture, this it's going to be dominant. It makes, well, no, I'm going to leave off some political commentary. Cultural appropriation is kind of like a hip millennial concept in some level, but it's a serious one as well. It's the idea that sometimes people take on aspects of, often it's of a minority culture, but it means something different in the dominant culture. I think as Jews, just a simple example is sort of like when you start hearing, you might be watching some very secular, it could even be a newscast, it could be a documentary, it could be an interview, and someone starts throwing in Yiddish words. Or which can sometimes be a little jarring. I mean, there's nothing against throwing in a Yiddish word, is there? And at the same time, are they taking my culture, and what's happening to my culture when someone from a broader culture is kind of adopting tropes from my culture? Okay, so there's all this kind of, this is just to start getting your brains, getting the wheels turning, right? And of course, Wikipedia is not the be all and end all of thinking about how cultures might interact, but there's a lot to start thinking about what we're trying to do as Jews in other cultures, which might be the natural way we think about it. And that's going to be a lot of the practical halacha that we're going to look at. Of course, when we're talking about the sources we're about to see from Tanakh, the framework is a little different, because on the one hand, we're going to start to see sources that are talking very much quickly off the bat about what the Jews are going to encounter, what Bnei Israel is going to encounter when they enter the land of Israel, where Eretz Israel is not uninhabited and fallow. It has other people and other cultures within it. And there the dynamic is particularly interesting, because on the one hand, the other cultures that pre-exist there are in a sense at that time dominant, but the plan, as it were, is for us to conquer Eretz Israel and for us to become the dominant culture. So what kind of, it's a different way of thinking about it than I think we often do when we think of ourselves as just sort of like a minority that is, let's say in America, might be bound to be a minority. By the way, this stuff also comes off very differently in Israel, right? So let's say questions of cultural appropriation with Arab culture would come up in Israel in an interesting way. But one step at a time. We're not going to be able to cover all of these issues in this year, of course, but let's get started and let's look at a little Tanakh. And just a few different psukim. Also, I want you to be thinking as we go through them about the concepts that I just kind of name dropped. And I want you to be thinking about what picture these psukim seem to be painting of how Bnei Israel are going to be interacting with the cultures that they're going to encounter in Eretz Israel. So we'll start with Shemot. So God's going to send his angel before you. So God is going to put this angel before us and bring us into this land where these are all the different nations that we're going to face. And God's going to cut them off. Lo tishtachaveh le'eloheihem v'lo tavdim. Lo ta'aseh k'ma'asehem. You're not to bow down to their gods. You're not going to act as they act. Ki ha'ares tarsem v'shaber teshaber matzivotehem. You're going to destroy rather their them and their idolatrous trappings. V'avadtem et Hashem Elokeichem. Rather, we're going to serve God. That's, of course, particularly poignant right now. And then God's going to bless us, and among other things, he's going to keep illness away from us. But what's the idea? Here, what are we doing in our interaction with the Kanaani? So on the one hand, there's the religious element, right? We're not going to be accepting their religion. We're actually going to break their pillars. We're going to break their ways of, there are forms of idolatry. And at the same time, there's this broader statement, and it's kind of intriguing. Lo ta'aseh k'ma'asehem. You're not supposed to do what they do. And the question, of course, is, what that means. What's the extent of what we're talking about? In more halachic terms, we come back to this again. We come back to it in Chumash Vayikra a couple of times. K'maaseh Eretz Mitzrayim asher yeshavtem ba lo tasu. We should not be, again, this word maaseh, right? Deed, this very vague word. We should not be doing like the deeds of the land of Egypt, where you settled. U'ch'maaseh Eretz Canaan asher ani mevi etchem shama lo ta'asu. Not going to do like the deeds of the Canaani. U'chukotehem lo telechu. This is the kind of almost halachic core of a lot of our discussion. In their ordinance, you shall not go. In ordinances, you shall not go, or you shall not walk. Rather, et mishpatai tasu, let chukotai tishmeru. Rather, you should be keeping my, this is God talking, my laws, my ordinances, lalachet bahem, to go in them, ani Hashem Elokechem, I am the Lord your God. So again, we're not doing the ma'aseh. We're not doing these deeds of these other peoples, though we haven't defined yet what these deeds are. And additionally, we're not going in the way of their ordinances. Okay, a couple more just to fill it out. Ushmartem et kol chukotai ve'kol mishpatai v'asitem otam. You're going to follow all of God's ordinances and laws and do them. Ve'lo taki etchem ha'aretz asher ani mevi etchem shama lashevet ba. And if you do that, the land's not going to spit you out, the land that I brought you there to dwell in. Again, right? It's repeating what we saw before. Don't go in the way of the ordinances of the nations, the non-Jewish nations, that I'm sending out from before you, because they did those things. I'm glad that we made it. And it seems like some of you have made it back already. That's encouraging. The Seder. So I'm sorry. I apologize for I apologize for whatever the technical difficulty was. And let's try to get ourselves back on track. So just before I go back to share screen, getting refocused, what were we doing? We had started to talk about acculturation, right? We were talking about how so a member of one culture entering into another culture actually has a number of choices to make. Maybe those choices are intentional, maybe they're not intentional, about how they're going to be interacting with their original culture and with the culture of the environment that they now find themselves in. And we had started to look at some psukim to see what we would find. In the first couple of psukim that we saw, we're talking about not doing like the deeds of the Mitzri or of the Kanaani. And then we also saw a formulation of uchukotehem lo telechu, not going or following the non-Jewish ordinances. All right, let's see if we can get back on track. I'm gonna try to share screen again. Let's hope it goes well. Okay. And no, that did not work. Sorry, this might take me a moment. Here. Okay, and we're back. Okay, getting back on track. So we saw again the phrase of lo telchu b'chukot hagoy, and the last point that we were starting to see in the verse was an idea that the land isn't going to tolerate this, but then these verses go into a slightly different direction, and they add that Ani Hashem Elokechem, I'm the Lord your God, Asher hivdalti etchem min ha'amim. I am the Lord your God who distinguished you from the nations. In other words, we'd seen earlier a similar idea to what we'd seen previously of just not doing like they did and not following their ordinances. It's sort of the no. But now we also see on some level a more positive formulation. We're supposed to be actively, does this ring a bell in terms of models of acculturation we started to talk about? We're supposed to be actively separate. God separated us. And then it continues, and this verse in particular is pretty powerful. V'yitem li kedoshim, and you will be sacred to me, ki kadosh ani Hashem, because I, the Lord, am sacred. Va'avdil etchem min ha'amim liot li, and I set you apart from other nations to be mine. If this statement about setting you apart from other nations to be not mine were just there on its own, we wouldn't necessarily connect it to our discussion. But it's pretty suggestive coming right after the discussion of God's ordinances that we have to keep versus the ordinances of the Goyim, which we're not supposed to. There's something suggestive here about a positive act of separation. So if we think about the models we were looking at, of the models, we're definitely, the echoes here certainly sound more separatist than integrationist, right? That at least at this stage seems relatively clear. Okay, let's move forward. There are a few more examples of this kind of a thing. We're not going to get into every detail because we're a little limited in time. But, you know, Bilam, when he's talking about Am Yisrael, he describes it as Am levadad yishkon. We're a nation that dwells to itself. Uvagoyim lo yitchashav, and it's not going to be counted among the nations. We're somehow different. In Devarim, we're warned in a slightly different way. Hishamer lecha, be careful. Guard yourselves. Pentinakesh achareim, lest you be ensnared after them. Acharei shamdam mipanecha, after they've been destroyed, i.e. the Goyim in Eretz Yisrael, and from before you. Pentidrosh lelohehem lemor echa yavdu agoyim ha'ela et Elohehem ve'sekein gam ani. Here is an idea that be careful because you're going to be ensnared and you're going to want to follow their gods. So we saw before, and we come back to it, we have the idea of not following Avodah Zarah. We have two less well-defined ideas of not following their chok and of their chukim, their ordinances, and of not following their ma'asim, really not so clearly defined just yet. And we have a last idea that God has deliberately tried to establish us as being, he's deliberately established us as separate, that there's an ideal of us being actively different and distinct. Okay, and there's other things, that one particular one I'll just show you quickly from Zephaniah, because it's going to come up later. This also comes up specifically with respect to clothing in Zephaniah. Zephaniah is talking about this sort of like a day in which God is going to wreak punishment on all wrongdoers. And on this day, Ufakadti al hasarim, I will remember with punishment the princes, Val bnei melech, the ministers or king's sons, Val kol halovshim malbush nochri. I, says God, will punish all those who wear, fascinating, right? Foreign clothes. So we saw different examples of what it could be. And one example here already in Tanakh is that there's a question about taking on the clothes of the other cultures, or of the Kanaani culture, let's say. Okay, now moving on, one of the memories let me put this slightly differently. One of the sources that I imagine many of you are familiar with, but perhaps not all of you, talks about what sets the nation of Israel apart in Egypt. It's nice actually, because we're getting started with Chumash Shmot these days. And part of the narrative is that somehow, even though we're in Egypt, or we're dwelling in Egypt for so long, somehow we still keep an identity that is somewhat distinct as the Jewish people. And there are different accounts. I brought you here just two examples. There are actually many different versions. I think I found at least 4 different versions of this midrash in rabbinic literature about what it was that the Jews did that helped them be distinct, that helped merit redemption. So, for example, Rav Huna b'shem Rav Bar Kapara says, "Bishvil arba'a dvarim nigalu Yisrael mimitzrayim." Right? There are 4 reasons why the Jews were redeemed from Egypt. Shelo shinu et shman, velo shinu et lishonam, shelo amru lishon hara, shelo haya behen protz erva. 4 things. They didn't change their names. They didn't change their language. And then they didn't speak Lashon Hara, and they weren't engaged in illicit sexual practices, illicit relations, things that would be prohibited by halacha. If you think about it, those are actually some very strong aspects of culture, right? Back to our acculturation that we were talking about in the beginning, those are classic examples of cultural markers. When we're saying that we didn't change our names or we didn't change our language, what we're saying effectively is we were redeemed in part because we didn't assimilate or because we didn't fully integrate. Now, there's another version, which is probably the one that those of you who've heard this before are more familiar with. She'ama busham umachlam ulshonam mishunim mina mitzrim. Why were we redeemed, or how were we mitsuyanim? How are we set apart there? Our clothing, back to clothing. Isn't it interesting how often clothing comes up? Our clothing and our food, as well as our language, were kept different. Misumanim hayu biduyim shehem goy levadam chaluk mina mitzrim. By dint of these practices, we made it clear that we were our own nation, distinguished from the Mitzri. So the verses that we've been seeing, I see there's something in the chat. If you think it's pressing, I welcome you to unmute because we're a small group. I think you could ask a question. Otherwise, I'll hope to look at the chats at the end of our session, because if I look in the middle, I'll get unfocused.
Lori, it's Elise. Yeah. I just wanted to ask, I thought also they were different because they kept doing Brit Milah.
Okay, so there are different versions of this. I actually don't think that I'm aware of a version that mentions Brit Milah in this midrash, though there might be other parallel midrashim that are slightly different that have it. But in the framework of these are the things they did, I'm not familiar with one that says specifically Brit Milah.
And wasn't that an issue before Korban Pesach that they? According to some of Chazal, that they had to do Brit Milah first? And when God talks about the blood and the blood of Brit Milah and the blood of the Korban.
Right, so there's a question about what's going on in general with Brit Milah and Am Yisrael at different stages. We're not having Brit Milah, let's say in the Midbar. We're going to put this aside for now because it's not the central question. And actually, it's actually, I think, important to notice that these examples are not Brit Milah. Why? What's my point? These examples are not about religion per se. They're not mitzvah examples. We might have thought that the examples for why we would merit to be redeemed would be things like they were steadfast in their belief in God. And that's not the examples that are being brought in this context. In this context, what's being brought out is, here's how the culture remained distinct. Now, we could say that names have a holy aspect to them or an element of prophecy or tradition. And we could say that the Hebrew language has its own level of sanctity. And certainly not engaging in illicit sexual behavior has religious overtones, and yet these are less, on the whole, these are less of, the impression we're getting is less of a religious system as being what's being pointed out here, and more of a cultural system being pointed out here. Now, keeping the distinct culture might well have been facilitated by the fact that there are profound beliefs that animate or that connect the group that's attached to that culture, right? I'm not saying that these things are completely distinct. Why would we be committed to remaining as one person, as one people? Well, part of that would be because of our brit, absolutely. But it's manifesting itself here in ways that one might describe as not just religious, but also as cultural. And I think that's pretty interesting. Let's get into more of the formal halachic definition of what we're talking about, as I see that time is running away with us. So these are midrashei halacha. This is midrash halacha sifrei on Dvarim, and this is the midrash halacha on Vayikra. And each of them just points out different elements of what this can mean. So what is the concern in Dvarim that we talked about not being ensnared? Shema timshach achareim or shema tidmeh lahem. Shema taseh kemasem v'yu lecha l'mokesh. The fear is that we're going to be attracted by them. We're going to want to resemble them. And that's when we're going to start to do what they do. And given that Hashem has destroyed them, he doesn't want us to model our behavior on what they do. And now here what's interesting is we get some specific examples. Shalo tomar, one should not say, Hoel vehem yotzim b'teneh, af ani yotze b'teneh. They're going out with a basket, I'm going to go out with a basket. Could be maybe even a basket you might wear on your head. Hoel vehem yotzim b'argaman, af ani yotze b'argaman. They're going out in royal purple. I too need to dress in royal purple. Hem yotzim betolsim, they're wearing helmets. Af ani yotze betolsim. I'm going to go out in my helmet. Ve'aseh ken gam ani. There's an idea here that we're not supposed to just be mimicking that culture. The Sifra also talks about, also tries to define a little better what we're talking about. When you say you're not supposed to do things like they do, that could potentially apply to everything, which would be a little extreme. Yachol, you might have thought, lo yivnu binyanot, v'lo yit'u netiot kamotam. You might have thought that you shouldn't build buildings, plant plants, right? If we're really going to say you can't do what they do, maybe it's everything. That would be, of course, ridiculous. Talmud lamar of chukotehem lo telechu. No, there's this word of chukotehem in their ordinances. And that's supposed to be something more precise. Chukim hachakukim lahem ulavotehem lavot avotehem. These are ordinances that they had going back traditionally from father to son to son to son. And they bring one example, which is pretty explosive and really its own topic. They bring as an example men marrying men, women marrying women, and which we're leaving aside that topic for now. And they also bring an example of a man marrying a woman and her daughter, or a woman marrying two men. Okay. Another example that they bring about what does it mean of chukotehem lo telechu? You shouldn't take up their habits or their manners. And things that they have set up, like teatriot, kirkasaot, haastriot, theaters, circuses, arenas. We're not supposed to take up their pastimes that are really well established. Rabbi Meir says these are darchei ha'emori shemanu chachamim. There's a lot of rabbinic sources that talk about something called darchei ha'emori. It's not necessarily talking specifically about the emori that we know of already from Chumash, but there's an idea that there are certain types of behaviors, the kinds of things that get mentioned using certain types of amulets or certain types of magic types of behavior that we're not allowed to do, that might fall under, that seem to fall under this prohibition. It can even be how you get a haircut. Do you have a Roman haircut of the kumi safa, the Roman haircut? And lest v'shema tomar lahem chukim v'lanu ein chukim. Well, they've got all this great stuff going on. They have ordinances and we don't. No. That's why the pasuk says, "Et mishpatai ta'asu, v'chukotai tishmeru, lalechet bahem." That's why the pasuk says that you have to do God's mitzvot and God's ordinances. Okay, so far what have we got? We've got verses that have talked about not doing deeds, not doing ordinances, not doing idolatry, and have talked about a value in us being somehow separate and distinct. Then we've got midrashei halacha, which have built on that and have kind of made things a little more precise by laying out some of the examples of what they have in mind. It's not doing absolutely anything they would do. It's more focused on this idea of ordinances, but ordinances could mean even something like imitating the color clothing they go out in, or whether or not you're wearing a helmet, or whether or not you're going to the theater, which of course, for many of us would start to raise a lot of alarm bells. What does that mean about the kind of lives we lead? So we need a little bit more clarity in how we're going to define things. And for this purpose, it's interesting to compare the Uraim, Rav Eliezer Mimetz, who's a medieval Ashkenaz, and the Rambam. I'm going to try to do this quickly because I see that the time is going fast. Lo tasik ma'aseihem V'chukoteim lo telechu. You shouldn't do it in accordance to their deeds or their ordinances. V'areta melokecha. Rather, you should fear God. And now look very closely. V'lo telech b'chukot hagoyim. V'lo ta'aseh k'ma'aseim shel shiv'a ha'umot. Okay? He defines it carefully. The Urim says we're specifically talking about the 7 nations. It says this discussion, the actual Torah level prohibition, relates to the 7 nations in particular, not necessarily to all non-Jewish cultures. And he also says something else that narrows it very much, that in the Tosefta and Shabbos, there lists the Darchei Emory, is one place where Darchei Emory comes up. Of Tosefta de Shabbat Mamna, Kol Ma Shaita Kabbalah, Biad Chachamim, Shayu Mechukoteihem. So they list all these things that they had traditionally as falling under this category. Ve'en lo sif alehem. And you're not supposed to add to them. Ve'enam misvara ki'im b'Kabbalah. This whole matter, says the Urim, is not based on logic. It's based on tradition. If there's a tradition that there's something that we don't do, we don't do it. And if there's not such of a tradition, then there's more room. Okay, so the Urim is really defining the terms here very narrowly. The Rambam is more broad. The Rambam talks here, it talks in Sefer Mitzvot, in this translation, about the Kofrim, about those who deny God. In Hilchot Avodah Zarah, he says, Ovdei Kochavim, idolaters, okay? In Sefer Mitzvot, he talks about how this is in order, lihitrachek mahem, to keep distance from them, ulganot kol chukoteim, v'afilu amabush, to kind of hold negatively our view of that culture. In the Mishneh Torah, he focuses more on the issue that, that we're going to become like them, yidmeh lahem. And rather, the positive, that what we want is Sheyeh Yisrael muvdal mehen, that we should be distinct from them. So these themes repeat. Which motivation is primary kind of shifts from place to place. And we're still lacking, I think, a sort of fine-tuned sense of exactly when we have to be concerned and when not. If we go with Urim, it's much more narrow. It's going to be what specifically we have a tradition for, and it's going to be the Shiva Amim. But if we go with Rambam, potentially we're talking about something that's much more broad. And we're really, it sounds like, if we're thinking in the terms we started with about acculturation, it sounds very separatist, which make us wonder perhaps about some of the things that we do. So what becomes important in kind of fine-tuning the discussion are a couple of Gemaras, a few Gemaras. I'll just look at 2 of them. The first is from Masechet Sanhedrin. And it talks about an old custom. Something that used to be done was when a king would die, they would burn all of the things, all like the articles, the things that would belong to the king. Where the idea sort of would be that no one else, no other person should start partaking or connecting or using what the king's personal effects were. Now in Sanhedrin it says, Detanya, we learn in a Baraita, Sorfina la malachim v'lo midei darkei Amori. Jews are allowed to burn the effects of a Jewish king, and it's not considered to be one of these darkei ha'emori, which you'll remember is a subcategory of the chukot of the goyim. Heichi sarfinan, but wait a second, how can we burn them? V'akativ u'chukoteim lo telechu, but we do say that we're not allowed to go in the path of their ordinances, and isn't this one of them? Don't the goyim burn the effects of their kings as well? Ella kevan dechtiv sreifa b'oraita lav minayu kagamrinan. Because we mention it in the Tanakh, there's a part in Sefer Yirmiyahu where he's talking to Sidkiyahu, where he mentions burning the effects of the kings. Therefore, we're not really learning it from them. So here already we have a new way to narrow things down. There are things that they do that are just theirs, and there are things that they do that also are things that we do, that show up in the Chumash, that show up in Tanakh. And those things aren't a problem. Another potential way to narrow things down, actually, which is interesting because it parallels our discussion we just saw, but it's a little different. Sorfin al amlachim lilo midarchei amori, same beginning. You can burn the effects of the kings, and it's not considered to be midarchei amori. But if it's an ordinance, how can we do that? Chukotein lo telechu. Rather, dechulei al masreif alav chukahi. This is very important. Burning the king's effects is not considered to be an ordinance. Why not? Ella chashivutahi. It's considered to be a reflection of the king's importance. What does that mean? Well, what the Ran says it means is it has a rationale. There's a rationale to burning the king's effects. You burn the king's effects because the king is so important, and you prove or you establish to everyone that you're recognizing the king's importance by not letting them use the king's things after the king is deceased. So we now have two new ways to narrow down our definition of what we're worried about. One way is something that shows up in our Tanakh, something that shows up in our tradition. Another way is something that really has its own independent rationale. Something that really, as it were, makes sense, makes good sense to do. This ties in nicely with the term chok, doesn't it? Because often when we talk about chok versus mishpat, one of the ways we explain the distinction between these two types of law is that a chok doesn't necessarily have a clear explanation, right? So uvchokotehem lo telechu might really be focused on the things they do without a clear explanation. And in fact, this is what Marie Cologne, it's kind of a primary. I'm going to move to sort of more practical halachic applications in a moment, so we can finish off with something to take home. But Marie Cologne, in his tshuva, is the landmark tshuva on the topic. He says that there's only really two concerns that come under the rubric of this law. Number one, nir'eli d'dvar pashut lo lesor mishum chok ela be'echad mishnei chalakim. Echad, one. Things where the rationale is not clear, as the language of chok suggests. So why? Because if you're doing something that doesn't have a clear rationale, it really does start sounding like that language that we saw in the Midrashei Halacha. Well, he's going out with his helmet, so I'm going to go out with my helmet. Why are you going out with your helmet? Now, if you're going out with a helmet because you need to protect yourself from being shot, we're not going to say you can't do that because the idolater was doing that. That's something that's a clear rationale. But if you're going out with the helmet because it's the trend of the day, that's something different. That might be a chok. It might be a chok, right? Depending on the situation. So he says, number one, does it have a clear, explicit, a really evident rationale? Because if we're doing it otherwise, it would seem that the reason we're doing it is because on some level, otherwise it seems like we're attracted to them or we're being pulled along by them. And on some level, we're acknowledging their ability to establish what the culture is. We're falling for, you could say, cultural hegemony. Why would you do something with no rationale just because others are doing it, if not implicitly saying that you're following their path? The second thing he says is hadavar asher sheyach bo nidnud pritzut geder hatzniut. It says the other thing, the anava, is something that kind of breaks the bounds of Jewish modesty and humility. Now, what modesty and humility mean is an actually interesting question. Is he talking about sexual immodesty? It doesn't sound like it because, again, he brings it in with humility. There's something about, and then he comes back to it, ideas of ga'ava, okay? Things that are acting in a way that's sort of showing off or haughty or overly prideful. He thinks that also is potentially chukat hagoyim. Okay, let's try to put these pieces together and just talk quickly about some applications. And Bezrat Hashem will also get to see a little Repenkin and even take some questions. Number one, bat mitzvah. Is bat mitzvah an issue. Why would bat mitzvah be an issue? Well, originally Jews didn't really celebrate that much bat mitzvahs, right? And what was celebrated, but the celebration of bat mitzvah starts within Reform Judaism, but it may well have been influenced by seeing Christian confirmation type ceremonies. And if that's the case, is it appropriate to celebrate a bat mitzvah? So Rav Yaakov Yechiel Weinberg, the Sridei Eish, was asked this question: if it's mutter to celebrate a bat mitzvah, and there are those who want to prohibit it because of chukoteim. And he says, well, you know, number one, if we say that the reason they make a confirmation, hu l'shem avodah zarah, yesh le'asur. He says, look, if fundamentally what we're talking about is something that's following a pattern that's connected to idolatrous practice, then yeah, that would be a problem. Maybe. I'm sorry, let me correct that. Maybe that would be a problem. But now he says maybe not. But wait a minute. What about the bar mitzvah? Bar mitzvahs were not always bar mitzvahs that we know today. What were bar mitzvahs originally? You know, maybe the guy gets an aliyah l'Torah. You know, at some point you get babka and maybe a little bit of schnapps, right? That's the bar mitzvah. Aliyah l'Torah, babka, and schnapps. When did the bar mitzvah become this bar mitzvah? Is that not also based on the confirmation? Are we not influenced on some level by that? What's really going on? Is the idea that we're trying to emulate an idolatrous practice? No, that's not what's really going on. What's it really about? It's chagigat simchatam l'regel bagrutam shel bneihem. It's an expression of joy at the child's maturity. That's what's fundamentally going on. And that's a little bit different. And he says, Achenu shenhigu ze mechadash chagigat bat mitzvah omrim, שהם עושים כן כדי לחזק בלב הבת, שהגיעה למצוות, רגש אהבה ליהדות ולמצוותיה, ולעורר בה רגש הגאון על יהדותה ועל היותה בת לעם גדול וקדוש. ולא אכפת לנו מה שגם הגויים חוגגים חגיגת ה-confirmation בין לבנים לבין לבנות. הם בדידהו, ואנו בדידן. We're doing this because we want to strengthen the girl's religious feelings, or at least that's why people are trying to bring in the bat mitzvah. And the idea is to make the child who's growing up proud of being Jewish and being a part of our nation. And in that case, the fact that there happens to be a confirmation ceremony, which might have some similarities to what we're doing, well, that's their stuff, and this is our stuff. And, you know, the fact that they daven and bow down in their churches doesn't mean that we can't daven and bow down in synagogue. It says at some point, not everything should be seen as their ordinance. And therefore, he thinks that there's really room to have a bat mitzvah. So that's an example. I think it's also interesting because back to separatist versus integrationist, is it on that spectrum or is it something different? And that's also, it's a little tricky. The bat mitzvah in its way is something that really is very much within Jewish culture. The way it's celebrated, I think, well, it might depend on where and how it's being celebrated, but in more religiously observant circles, it's typically celebrated in a way that's emphasizing religious values, as opposed to sort of to other possibilities. And the idea that it's affected by a secular culture that's also recognizing maturity, is that really some way that we've kind of been affected by another culture, or is this something that is just giving us, are we just finding new expressions of sort of older traditional Jewish themes? Like it's just sort of an interesting thing to try to track, like exactly how and where the idea comes from, and at what point is it sort of native, and at what point is it sort of foreign. And I think that's what the Sridei Eish is really talking to here, is that we can't necessarily always put things on just this separatist, integrationist kind of an axis. There are different types of values which are not foreign to Judaism. It's not foreign to Judaism to be excited that someone is reaching the gil of mitzvot, the age of mitzvot. But that doesn't mean that there's been no influence whatsoever. The way that that influence is played out, the way this is playing out, though, is not necessarily integrated, right? It's our own, it's a native cultural expression. Theater. Rav Moshe Feinstein talks about going to the theater. He winds up saying that he doesn't think that it's really an issue of chukotehem, because why? That's specifically when we're talking about an ordinance that's related to idolatry, of doing something that's just stam, without really a rationale. Here he says, we know what the rationale is. What's the rationale? The rationale is leitzanut. The rationale is to have fun. Rationale is to relax. The rationale is to blow things off. That's how he understands the theater. So what he wants to say is like this. He doesn't think you should go to the theater because he doesn't think the values of attending the theater are necessarily are our values. And on that level, he doesn't think you should go. But from the perspective of adopting non-Jewish culture, it doesn't technically apply because it doesn't fall under the definition that we saw, for example, in the Marek. Okay, next example, Thanksgiving. Rav Moshe Einstein also has a tshuva about Thanksgiving, where fundamentally says, you know, Thanksgiving, it's not just for them, it's also for us, it's for anyone in the country, as it were. Why? Because it's Yom Zecher L'Anshei HaMedina. It's a day that's remembering the people that were in this country. Shu gam ken sameach b'Hamedina sheba lagur kan ata o mikvar. And also the Jew who lives in this country is happy about the country. America was a real gift to the Jews, and anyone living in the latter 20th century would have to recognize what level of a gift it was. There's room to be a part of that. Lo matzinu bazeh isur lav b'asiyat simcha b'seuda. Therefore, says Rav Moshe Feinstein, there's no prohibition of making a seuda, and not even of eating turkey. But there's a problem of making that as though it were to be a new ordinance. Like you shouldn't treat Thanksgiving like a religious obligation. Here comes Rav Henkin, and Rav Henkin actually expands on this idea. He brings up a few points. Number one, what about shul, minyan? You have the day off for Thanksgiving. Can you change minyan time so you sleep in a little bit? Here would be an example where it's actually affecting your religious practice a little, to be taking on some element of Thanksgiving. And he says, you know what, it's okay. Why is it okay? Because everyone knows, the main reason why we change the minyan times is because everyone's off work. Not specifically that's Thanksgiving. He even suggests that there might be a possibility of doing that in Christmas, but then he kind of pulls back from that and says it's a bridge too far. From that perspective, he thinks it's okay to be eating turkey as well and to have a Suda, but then he adds something which is interesting, which is that he says that at the same time, it shouldn't just be that you have in mind that you're not treating it as a religious ordinance. It should also be that you're not going to do it every single year. He thinks it would be healthy if if every few years you skip Thanksgiving, to show that it's not really a religious obligation. So Rav Henkin is building on Rav Moshe, says there's room for the Jew in America to keep Thanksgiving, but the Jew in America shouldn't make Thanksgiving something that he's treating like it's a religion that he has to keep. And he points out, the things that for the most part, the nation that's surrounding you, the surrounding culture is doing for their own pleasure. And it's not fundamentally a matter of idolatry. The yesh bo tam, and it has a rationale, which is what we keep coming back to. Then it doesn't matter to us if also the very firm Christians are doing it for the sake of their religion, because that's it's still not technically really an issue of Chukat Hakum. Okay, I see we're almost out of time. I want to just quickly raise at least so you know what some of the other things are that come up. Both Rav Feinstein and Rav Henkin deal with clothing, aspects of clothing from the perspective of Chukat Hakum. So for example, Rav Henkin comes out very strongly saying you shouldn't misinterpret what the Marik says to start saying that any kind of fashion that might be attractive would somehow be Chukat Akum because it's influenced by notions of by Gentile, by foreign to Judaism goals of becoming attractive or pursuing things that are immodest. He says that that's not a correct reading. If you did that, you'd have to go out against almost anything that's beautiful physically or aesthetically. It doesn't make sense, but he does call into question sort of material excess or materialism, not because of Chukat Akum, but because of our goal of being, on the whole, living lives of humility. The Igros Moshe talks about if you still have to dress like you're Polish, if you become an immigrant to a new place. And he points out, you know, the fashions in a given place, like let's say, for example, America, it's not just the non-Jews are dressing like American, the Jewish Americans are dressing like Americans. And the fact that both groups are participating in it makes it different from perhaps from the scenario in another place. It's interesting that he's willing to say that because, of course, we saw in the Midrashim, we saw in Sefania, there's much that comes up in terms of clothing when there's not a specific rationale for wearing it. But at the same time, part of what Moshe is getting at is that the clothes in Poland weren't necessarily specifically only Jewish as well, or chosen by Jews representing Jewish ideals, let's say. There's a question that comes up that there was a book about tzniut where they wanted to claim that there was an issue of chukat hagoyim for women to wear long dresses skimming the floor because that was the prevalent fashion among the non-Jew. And Rav Henkin says that this is also completely off, and this is where he starts talking about the issues of excess. And then there's a very, very nice tshuva by Rav Henkin also about Yom HaZikaron. When in Israel, what's done is there's an alarm or a siren that's played, and then people stand in kind of respectful silence. Is that a kind of non-Jewish practice that we can't take on? And he explains that in his understanding, there's a rationale. And he also adds, look, in the Torah, we don't have the idea of standing up specifically in memory or in honor of the dead, but we do have halachic sources that talk about standing as a way of showing respect. And we don't have to have, says Rav Henkin, an exact one-to-one correspondence between our practice or our traditional practice within our culture and a new practice to be able to defend it as against a charge of Chukat Akum. Okay, so let me summarize and let's take some questions. So how will we put these pieces together? I apologize again for the break in the middle, which I think it threw me off a little bit. I hope you guys are still able to get something out of our learning today. What we saw was that the Chumash is very preoccupied with what's going to be for the Jew entering the land of Israel and dealing with the Canaani. And the definition of what it is to be Jewish is to be doing something different, to be following God's laws, not to be following their practices. And that all makes some sense. But what's added in our study was seeing how that winds up applying to now. And the way it lines up applying to now is that you could paint a very, very strongly separatist picture in which effectively our culture would be completely sealed off. And that would be a very broad reading of the sources. But a more precise reading of the sources shows that it's not total separatism, that we're able to maintain a separate identity as long as we're careful about a few things, where those things include not just imitating for the sake of imitation, right? Taking things on when they have a rationale or when they don't conflict with other Torah values, where aside from the rationale, there's also looking and seeing if sometimes there are actually things within our tradition that give precedent for what we're doing. And there's also, of course, this overarching thing, which is that there's room to distinguish between practices that are bent towards idolatry and other types of practices. And yeah, there's also room to distinguish even between the non-Jew of today and the Canaani of biblical times. And at the same time, there's still a sort of tension. And there's still a sort of tension because the idea of Jewish sanctity does entail a very strong component of a united culture. That's not the same of the culture around us. So I think if we were to go back to kind of those parameters, we don't, what we've seen today doesn't fit neatly into those categories. It's not 100% separatist. It's more nuanced than that. It's much more nuanced than that. And at the same time, it's hard to say that it's really integrationist either. There's an idea that what we're really supposed to be doing is consciously, with very careful awareness, figuring out what aspects of the culture around us can satisfy halachic parameters and fit into a life as a Jew or Jewish culture, and what can't. And it's not a total free-for-all, but there often might be more room than people think. For example, the fact that there are Christian confirmations doesn't mean that there can't be Jewish bat mitzvahs. But even sometimes when we don't have a question of Chukat Akum, we do have to think very carefully, because even then there might be other values where there's a real distinction between what we're doing. So that, let's say the theater, you could make an argument for going to the theater, but what Rav Moshe is saying is if what the theater is about is nothing, there might be a problem of Chukat Akum. If what the theater is about is leitzanas, is silliness, is total frivolity, then there's another problem. And so too, we could say something similar about clothing with what we saw with Rav Henkin, right? If what dressing is about is completely pointless with no specific goal other than a trend, you may or may not be able to raise an issue. If there's a tznius concern, that might not be a Chukat Akum issue, but there could still be a consideration that would inform how the Jew is dressing. Okay, with that, I'm going to stop for now and invite any questions, comments, or you name it. I'll even look at the chat. And so you should feel free to unmute yourselves. Non-Jews now want bar mitzvahs sometimes, yeah. Right, and you can use the legal holidays can become an opportunity to spread Torah, right? That's also part of the question is, do we relate to things only as a threat, or do we relate to them also sometimes as an opportunity? And we have to be aware of both possibilities. What about language? Language is a really good question. The challenge with language, one of the complications there is that when we say that Hebrew is a holy tongue, there was a whole school of thought that should be saved for certain purposes, that almost you wouldn't want to vulgarize Hebrew by speaking in Hebrew in every kind of daily moment. So you have one school of thought that would want to, let's say, stay in Yiddish, right? Yiddish would be the perfect solution, right? A Jewish language that's not specifically Hebrew, that can handle the whole wealth of secular affairs, or you could say Hebrew. English. At the same time, we see that, right, the Mitzrayim, the Jews within Mitzrayim are praised for preserving their language. And yet we also know that, for example, the Jews of Ezra's time are given a fixed language of tefillah because they're not speaking English well already then. And Ezra is instituting a targum to the Torah reading when the Torah is read, because not all Jews are going to speak the language. So there seems to be a very early acknowledgement in our sources that we're not going to necessarily be able to maintain Jews speaking exclusively Hebrew in all settings, and certainly not in the diaspora. Though I think, it's a good question on people like me who live in Israel and speak English within their families, how exactly that works or why. And you could also ask the question about learning Torah in English. But again, if we want people to understand the Torah, and that's the language that they understand, then we wouldn't want to lose that. But it is a certain kind of sensitivity. Remember, one of the examples we also saw was Lashon Hara. So even if you're not talking, that wasn't in the world of Uvchukotehem, but that was in the world of that midrash that was talking about culture. There are a lot of things to talk about in terms of what language can do and how refined it is and how we use it that are not specific to whether you're using Hebrew or not, but can be definitive of how a Jew is really supposed to speak. Okay, other thoughts or questions before we give you a little break?